Hello, everyone, and welcome to the World Obesity Live webinar. I'll just give a few seconds as people are joining. This webinar is on COVID-19, obesity, and inequity, and very pleased to have you all join us. If we go to just some housekeeping whilst we are waiting for everyone to join. To note that this webinar will be recorded. Please don't forget to use the Q&A function on Zoom, which is the bottom right of your screen, to post comments and questions, and we will answer those during the panel discussions. You can just post them as they come up, and the panelists, as they complete their presentations, will take a look and may answer some as we go. You'll have an opportunity to ask a couple of questions after each presentation, but we'll hopefully get a good bit of time at the end for a group discussion. And the recording, the slides, the feedback form, and certificate of attendance will be circulated after the webinar. Okay, I think we've got most people joining now. Okay, so just by way of introduction, my name is Tolly Oni. I am at the University of Cambridge MRC Epidemiology Unit. I'm a public health physician, an epidemiologist, and I'm pleased to chair this session today. We've got a really exciting whistle-stop tour around the world, and the agenda is as follows. After the brief introductions, we will have perspectives on small island developing states from Professor Olafia Samuels. We will then whisk you across to the East Asia Pacific region and to hear from Fiona Watson from UNESCO. And lastly, we will hear from Professor Shefalika Goenka on the responses and the lockdown experience in India and some common themes that are emerging. And then we'll hopefully have a good bit of time at the end for some discussion, and then we'll close off. Does that sound like a good plan? Great. Okay. All right. So without further ado, I will show you this one slide just to recenter us on why we're here. Not going to talk too much to it because I know this has been covered in previous seminars, but the reason we're here discussing COVID, obesity, and inequity is this, which shows that the risk of COVID mortality is significantly increased in the presence of certain comorbidities, including obesity, with a gradient of increasing risk of mortality with increasing severity of obesity. I've put that link in there for you if you would like more information on case studies and data on this. But this is just a reminder of why we're talking about COVID-19, obesity, and inequity. Great, welcome everyone. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to our speakers. We'll first have, as I mentioned, Professor Samuels, who's a former director of the Georgia Lane Chronic Disease Research Center, and is a public health physician, epidemiologist, and co-chair of the World Obesity Federation Policy and Prevention Committee. Then we will hear from Fiona Watson, based in Thailand, who is the nutrition consultant at UNICEF, East Asia and Pacific Regional Office, UNICEF, excuse me. And lastly, we'll hear from Professor Shefalika Goenka from India, who is a professor at the Indian Institute of Public Health and head of bioethics and social behavioral sciences at Public Health Foundation of India and the Center for Disease Control. But first up, so I don't exceed my time, I'll hand over to Olafia to take us through the risk factors in small island developing states. Olafia?
Thank you very much, Todo. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to put up my first slide, impact of COVID-19 and inequity on small island states. So where are these small island states that we're referring to? So there are scattered mostly in the Caribbean and the Pacific and a few off of the coast of Africa. So next slide will show you the developmental status of most of these states. Most of them are clustered in the high human development area. Certainly most countries in the Caribbean, most islands in the Caribbean, except for Haiti. In terms of the Pacific, they are sort of half and half between high human development and medium human development. And most of the states are in the Caribbean and Pacific, and I'm going to speak mostly to the Caribbean because that's where I am in Jamaica. Next slide. So small island states share certain similarities, and one of the issues is that they are states that have vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities in terms, for example, of their small size, very dispersed, especially in the Pacific Ocean. Climate change, of course, is a big problem for us. We're vulnerable to disasters. Also economically vulnerable because of small and undiversified economies. We have high levels of economic vulnerability, even when we are high income countries. And nutritionally vulnerable, which I will go into a little bit later, talking about lack of food sovereignty, very high rates of obesity, both in adults and children, and so high levels of nutritionally related diseases. Next slide. So talking about obesity in small island states, let's first of all look at what is the current, meaning pre-COVID status, because obviously we don't have a lot of data post-COVID because we actually aren't even post-COVID, we are mid-COVID. But the background in terms of obesity in small island states, these states are mostly in the Commonwealth, I guess because we were small and easily conquered. So we find that there has been some studies done, a Commonwealth report, and we looked at the small island states, and you can see that over time, the obesity in childhood has been accelerating dramatically, and that's the story across the board, accelerating obesity. But even within the small island states, you can see that the Pacific has the highest obesity, followed by the Caribbean. Next. And trends in the Caribbean have been similarly going up over time. Next. This is from data from Jamaica. Next. And shows 3 population-based surveys that have been done over time, and clearly increasing obesity, female more than male. Next. And so the result of this increasing obesity is that there are increasing rates of non-communicable diseases. And you can see over the 3 surveys over time, really sharp increases in diabetes as well as in hypertension. Next. So in the Caribbean, our experience with obesity-related non-communicable diseases is that we have the highest morbidity and mortality in the Americas. 40% of NCD deaths occur prematurely between the age of 30 and 70 years. And obesity is a leading risk factor for both hypertension and diabetes. And unhealthy diets are the leading risk for premature mortality in the Caribbean. Next. And this is just illustrating the extent of the premature mortality in the Caribbean. So if you look, for example, near to the bottom, you will see the United States. This is cardiovascular mortality. And at the top, you will see Guyana and Trinidad. And you will note that the Trinidad and Guyana rates are about 3 times the rates in North America. And this is deaths from cardiovascular disease before the age of 70. Next. This is related to our food systems and obesity. And on the left, you see male and female overweight and obesity in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And on the right, you see the percentage of our food consumption that is imported. And you see the very dramatic increase over time. Next. So we lack food sovereignty. So many small island states have enough income to feed themselves. The question is the nutrition quality of the foods. And we are highly reliant on the food imports because of lack of space and lack of economies of scale to grow food at a competitive price. And importers like tinned foods that can sit on the shelf and have a long shelf life. We are importing around 60% of our foods in the Caribbean and about 60% also in the Pacific. Next. So just quickly looking at what this means in terms of consumption. This is a global picture in terms of age and the amount of foods that are being consumed. So let's look at red, which is for sugar. And globally, you can see that that peaks at about age 10. And then declines somewhat. And the next slide is sugar consumption in Barbados, which is literally going off the charts. And that is the reason why, next slide, you have had responses in terms of taxes on sugar sweetened beverages. So Barbados put on a 10% tax, but really the champion of small island states is the Bermuda that taxes sugar sweetened beverages at 75%. Next slide. So what has been the impact of COVID in the Caribbean? Well, first of all, we've been very lucky because we live an outdoors life and the houses are always open, the windows are open. So we haven't had that acute impact that has happened in North America where they live more in closed buildings. Next slide. And what has driven really our COVID obesity situation, one of the main things has been that we have a very large tourist industry. And when the tourist industry shut down, a lot of the food production in Jamaica that was destined for the tourist industry was redirected to the local market. And so you had the government trying to encourage people to actually grow, to continue growing, but also for the population to eat a more healthy diet. At the same time, you have had a reduction in income that has been quite severe. And so people really have less money. So it has been a challenge in that regard. Next slide. One of the things that has been done is that some of this excess food that was destined for the tourist industry that's now being used locally has been directed to some of our large manufacturers. And there's a company called True Juice that has been, in business for many years. And they now have been using some of this excess product to come up with a new product for the market, which is tomato pineapple juice, which I'm told tastes really nice. I'm not sure if I'm ready to venture into tomato and pineapple, but anywho, it's on the market and it's doing well. And it's one of these things that has come out of this change and has been helping to address that. Next slide. But the problem is that the overall market demand is not enough to consume the glut which we had for the tourist industry. So for example, the egg market, a third of the market, we just can't find any market for that. And so there have been problems in that regard. Next slide. So this slide is just showing the impact of COVID-19. So you will see over time, the big dip in the middle was in 2008, which was the international crisis. And so our unemployment rate was really coming down nicely, then shot up after the 2008 crisis. Then we started bringing it down again, doing quite well. But now the Bank of Jamaica is projected that our unemployment rates could climb back up to around 12%. Next slide. So in response, the government has actually tried to address some of these inequities by having a program of trying to support people who have lost their jobs. There has been a change in the price of foods. Some of them have become more expensive. There's increased food insecurity among the poor. About 300,000 of the population, which is 10% of our population, depends on tourism. And so that income has been pretty much wiped out. So there is increased poverty, increased food insecurity, and we expect that this will have direct impact on people's ability to consume. Next slide. Okay, that was my last slide. The last slide just had some references on it. And so thank you very much.
Thanks, Lafia. That was a really great expose into the Caribbean Small Island Development State experience. Just a reminder to everyone to please use the Q&A function and not the chat to pose your questions. And a reminder to the panelists to please, as you finish your presentations, if you just have a look at the Q&A and you can just type answers that are relevant to your presentation as we go so that we can answer in real time. Okay, so next up we have Fiona Watson, from nutrition consultant from UNICEF for the East Asia Pacific region. Fiona?
Greetings everybody from Bangkok, and today I'm going to be talking about COVID-19, obesity and inequality in the East Asia Pacific region. Next slide, please. I specifically want to focus on three questions. First of all, what is the challenge of obesity in the region? Secondly, what is the impact of COVID-19 been, particularly on diets? And then what are the new opportunities that have arisen to try to improve diets and healthy food systems because of COVID? Next slide, please. This region suffers from the triple burden of malnutrition. It means that there is a large number of children who are still undernourished, 13 million stunted and 4.5 million who are wasted. At the same time, 50 million are deficient in micronutrients, so that's vitamin and mineral deficiencies, mainly iron deficiency, anemia, because of poor diets and also high worm loads in some areas. And in addition, there is a rising burden of overweight and obesity. And you can see from these figures that while it's still only 9.7 million under fives, as children get older, we see more of them becoming overweight and obese. And at this point in time, we have 80 million overweight and obese children in the area. This triple burden doesn't just affect communities. It's not only coexisting in the same communities, but also in the same household. So it's more and more common to see, for example, overweight mothers with stunted and wasted children. Not only that, but we're also seeing it in the same individuals, children who are small for their age, probably micronutrient deficient, but also overweight. Next slide, please. The good news is that stunting and wasting or thinness are reducing. This is a slide from China, but it echoes what's happening in the whole region, which is a slow reduction in thinness and stunting. Unfortunately, the bad news is that overweight and obesity is rising at a dramatic rate. And you can see from that 1 in 5 children now are overweight in China, which is the biggest load in the region. Next slide, please. Just to note that UNICEF has 14 countries in this region, and they vary enormously in socioeconomic status, from low-income countries like North Korea to upper middle-income countries like Thailand, from small islands like the Pacific Islands to large urban areas like Manila and Bangkok. And certain countries have much higher levels of obesity and overweight than others. However, what is scary is that across the region, even countries which now have low rates of obesity, those are beginning to rise. So countries like Myanmar and Vietnam are going to have over 1 million obese children by 2030. The economic growth in this region has driven urbanization. So there are far more people coming now from rural areas to cities to work. This includes women. So it's very common for women to leave their children in rural areas to work in factories or doing domestic work in the home. But the economic growth has not been met with the same increase in equality. So there is increasing inequality in the region. For example, in Thailand, the top 10% of earners are earning 35 times more than the bottom 10%. In Indonesia, the 4 richest men have more wealth than the poorest 100 million people. So there's huge amounts of inequality. The other thing that's noticeable is the growing presence of food and beverage industry, who are bringing with them highly processed foods and, unfortunately, really limited regulation to control the marketing and sales of those foods. And the result of this is a switch away from the traditional diets, which tend to be healthier, to diets high in processed foods. And this leads to poor quality diets, and just at the bottom, it's the poorest who are always the worst affected. In the little bubbles on the right, there are just a couple of examples as to how the marketing is being done very cleverly to get around legislation which is brought in. We just mentioned the sugar tax in Bermuda. Thailand also has brought in a sugar tax. And one of the responses of the companies, which is in the blue bubble, is to make bottled water. This is marketed as bottled water. In fact, it has 30 grams of sugar per 450 milliliters of liquid. But it's managed to get the healthier choice label, which is provided by the Thai government. Another example is crisps, where they're being marketed as baked rather than fried and therefore lower in fat, but actually baked crisps contain more salt than a salted egg flavor crisp. And a further example is children's snacks being marketed as organic fruit snacks, but actually they contain more sugar than a biscuit. Next slide, please. Moving on to the impact of COVID-19. It has been very different in terms of the caseload across the countries in this region. Some countries have got away really pretty scot-free. Most of the Pacific Islands, Thailand has had a very low rate. We've had around 3,000 cases in total. We've had no cases for the last month at all. Vietnam and Cambodia, also very few number of COVID cases. Other countries, Indonesia and Philippines, have had a lot of cases. But the impact of COVID-19 is across the board. It has had a massive socioeconomic impact. Tourism, again, is very important in many countries here, and people's livelihoods have just been wiped out. So we're seeing loss of income, children not going to school, not getting that very much needed school food meal. Access to social protection has been sporadic and not enough for many people. There's been limited counselling on healthy diet through health services because health centres have either closed or are not working at full capacity. And that means that for many people, there's been a turn to cheaper, less nutrition diets. Lockdown and stress, we have some evidence that has resulted in an increased consumption of fast food and comfort snack eating. And there's been a huge increase in the home delivery market. And a lot of that food is fast food, which is being delivered. And also the use of convenience stores. These are the stores which are on the street corners, which are basically not selling anything very healthy at all. But it's closer than going to the local fruit and veg market. So people have turned much more to that. On the other side, there are some good things which have happened, which is evidence that there's far more home cooking going on. People have got more time at home and more concern about health and immunity, which means people are eating healthier diets. But at the moment, we do not know really what the impact has been on diets. There's very little data coming out of the region. It's very difficult to get data, and so we don't really know. Next slide. But to finish on a high point, there are opportunities to shape the food environment in this context of COVID-19. And I say the context of COVID-19 because I don't really see that there's going to be an end. There isn't a post-COVID-19. I think we're going to be in this situation for a long time. And here at UNICEF, we are trying to build on the opportunities that are presenting themselves. First of all, to drive the food supply to produce higher quality, local, nutritious foods. And for example, we have started to work in partnership with a delivery company called Grab. They deliver food, they deliver people, they deliver all sorts of goods in many countries in this region. To work with them to try to get good messaging on healthy eating and healthy lifestyles through their apps. And these go out to millions and millions of people. Secondly, to strengthen our efforts to build healthy food environments, and particularly in terms of strengthening regulation of the food environment. So the particular regulation that we're interested in is controls on marketing to children, on improving the school food environment, on front of pack labeling, the warning labels, and also on the retail environment. And then finally, our strategy is to empower young people to demand healthier diets, to demand access to healthier foods and to have a better food system. And we're particularly beginning to work with influencers such as bloggers and vloggers on beauty, sport, food, who are speaking to a lot of young people on social media to see how we can work with them to engage young people. Next slide, please. Finally, during COVID, we took the opportunity to work with some celebrity chefs in this region. We approached them and said, would they be interested in making videos, home videos in their own houses during lockdown, showing them making simple food, simple dishes, which were nutritious, vegetable and fruit based, and using traditional foods as much as possible. And we had an enormous response. We ended up with 7 chefs, some of them very well known indeed. One is the judge on MasterChef for Thailand, chefs from Vietnam, Cambodia, Philippines, and Pacific Islands, who made these videos to inspire people. And the response has been enormous. People are really inspired by seeing people doing recipes online. And what was great about working with the chefs is that they all share a passion for locally produced, fresh foods prepared using traditional recipes and celebrating the joy of eating with the others. We've asked people to send their own videos in if they wanted to make one. And just to end off, I want to end with a video which was sent in recently by a little boy who's half Thai and half Korean.
Thanks, Fiona. That was a really great practical example of kind of community mobilization to promote healthy eating. Okay, last but not least, we have, next slide, we have Professor Shifalika Goenka from India. What are your experiences, Shifalika? Shifalika, you're muted.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'll just be sharing some small thoughts on COVID-19, the syndemic, bracing the lockdown in India, and some common threads. A syndemic is the concomitant presence of two or more disease states which adversely affect the course and trajectory of the disease, enhancing vulnerabilities and inequities. 1 year back, in January 2019, the Lancet Obesity Commission published its report. The global syndemic of obesity, climate change, undernutrition, and nutrient deficiencies represents the paramount health challenge for humans, the environment, the planet in the 21st century. For example, in most low and middle income countries like India, we see the coexistence of obesity on one side and undernutrition, stunting, and anemia on the other. Whereas obesity has doubled in India in all states, 39% of our children are stunted and 60% are anemic. The Syndemic Commission recommended that there are common, structural, man-made drivers which need correction. The faulty food systems, faulty transport and urban design, defective and distorted land use policies, which have led to continuous deforestation, species extinction, disruption of the ecology. Strong businesses and profit motives have had primacy in the name of development. Just 1 year later, in February 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic struck the world and sadly brought large sections of the businesses to a grinding halt. The responsible virus, the SARS-CoV-2, is a zoonotic virus. According to the evolution biologists, its genetic backbone and receptor binding domain is clearly indicative that the virus evolved in animals for humans through a process of natural selection arising from continuous, repeated, unnatural animal and human proximity. Industrial meat production, wet markets, shrinking forests, forest encroachments, mining, road building, packed populations along natural reservoirs are some of the fertile petri dishes. These are exactly the drivers of the global syndemic. Now, a bit on the downstream effects. Last year, high temperatures in Europe were all over the media due to the temperatures around 30 to 34 degrees Celsius. In India, the temperatures are even higher, 36 to 45 degrees Celsius, 5 to 7 months a year, year after year, and more than 500 million people rough it out in the sweltering heat. Next slide, please. Structural injustice. Whereas only 3% of people in India use cars, 23% walk and 13% cycle. Yet our roads are made for cars. So when the lockdown happened in India, millions of poor people, migrants, trudged back home, hundreds of kilometers in sweltering heat, women and children included. Climate change and its drivers are affecting the poor in all its wrath. Next slide, please. To conclude, there are common drivers at work for the syndemic and the COVID-19 pandemic. In other words, the drivers for this syndemic, that is obesity, climate change, undernutrition, and the COVID-19 and other possible future zoonotic pandemics are the same. A fundamental shift in the gears is required. It's a public health, economic, and planetary imperative. If not now, when are we going to do it? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shifalika, for bringing us that bigger picture of planetary health and the justice perspective, which is so important. And thank you all for the excellent interventions. So we have a good bit of time now to take some questions, and I've been looking through. Thank you to the participants for some of your questions. I've been sifting through, so let's talk first about one thing that hasn't been mentioned particularly. Obviously, food and diets are very critical and a core aspect of obesity prevention. But let's talk about physical activity, particularly in the context, and Shifalika, you alluded to this in the context of the built environments and the predisposition and the over greater emphasis on cars. What is going on with the built environments and physical activity, particularly in the context of COVID, and bearing in mind we're talking about inequity? What's happening in Jamaica, Alafia, on this?
Sorry, I have to unmute. With physical activity, of course, with the lockdown, people have been required to stay home. But that was just for about 2 or 3 months. Now we are starting to reopen. So the beaches have been opened back again, so you can go there and have physical activity. You can, are freer to move around. But the schools are still closed, and so the children are not in school. They're supposed to be at home, doing their lessons and so on. But there's less, I would say that there's less physical activity during COVID lockdown, and it's starting to improve now.
And Fiona, you shared that really very interesting example with the chefs. Is there something similar, comparable for physical activity? Because with people at home and getting people interested and motivated in that way?
Yes, what I would say about physical activity in this region, it was low before COVID. It's very hot here, and it hasn't, physical activity is for poorer people who are working in the fields. It's not really become the same kind of fashionable thing that it's become in many European countries or westernized countries. It is very important. It's something particularly in the school environment that we're working on. What I would say is that it can also be used by the food and beverage industry, to take our eye off the fact that actually we're just eating rubbish food. So we have to be very careful to make sure that there isn't a non-balance with too much emphasis on physical activity. And if you look at places like China, a lot of their obesity strategy has actually just been on physical activity. So that was just a warning thing of how important it is. But yes, a very important aspect, particularly for adolescents, I think.
Yeah. And Shifalika, particularly if we, in the context of, because if we widen it, because you mentioned about planetary health and the functions of urban systems, of course these overlap with, exposure to air pollution and how safe it is for physical activity and increased risk of cardiovascular disease with those exposures. How do we start to shift those norms?
I completely agree with you. In fact, air pollution is a huge public health problem here in India and many other low and middle income countries. And we are seeing levels 10 to 15 times the permissible amounts. well, efforts are being made, but still they continue to be high. We saw very low levels during the lockdown period. Of course, they've now reverted back. But still, the overriding, so there's a lot of research going around how air pollution itself, some recent papers also from India, that how air pollution actually raises hypertension levels and is a direct risk factor for cardiovascular disease. However, there is a lot of the summary of evidence right now globally says that, yes, your benefits of physical activity get somewhat mitigated when there's air pollution, but still the benefits of physical activity override that of the harms the air pollution causes when you exercise and during air pollution. So the overall message has to be exercise, walk, move as much as you can.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Let's go to marketing. There was an interesting question on marketing of food, unhealthy foods. Somebody asked, does anyone know if is there any evidence that has changed around the COVID crisis? And relatedly, I would add, in addition to marketing, particularly in the context of food insecurity and food aid and responses. So does anyone want to talk about also that hidden marketing potentially in the context of aid of unhealthy foods?
So I can just say that in the Caribbean, the fast food industry has made very good use of this opportunity. So what they have done is that in some instances where people have lost their jobs and become food insecure, they have rushed in with baskets of all of these unhealthy foods. And you actually have pictures of government officials standing beside these fast food people giving out unhealthy food. And so there's this disconnect between what the government is saying 3 months ago about eat healthy, and they're standing now beside, these unhealthy foods. But the reality is that, what do you do? People are hungry and these people are offering food. Unhealthy food, but it's food. So it's a conundrum.
The same thing I would echo in this region. So we've seen in the Philippines, for example, so-called kindness kitchens, which are set up by a fast food company, giving out burgers and chips to frontline workers. The other example is actually on breast milk substitutes. The companies have leapt in to donate breast milk substitutes for babies. And just to echo Alafia, it's very difficult when people are hungry and when there's a real crisis, just to say, well, actually you can't eat that because it's not healthy. So they use the opportunity very well.
Well, in India, luckily, they had set up a lot of food kitchens for the migrants, and it was all fresh food being given out. So that was one thing good. So we had pulses and homegrown bread, which is roti, which was being given out, which is amazing. Of course, the other aspect was when people are at home, they tend to see much more television. The advertising is huge. Advertising freebies to the normal people. So they kind of succumb for not able to go out to eat, they succumb to that. But at least the food given out to the migrants was all healthy. So that was really good.
So it sounds like it would be quite interesting to add to the resources around these promising practice. So there is the chef type initiative that you shared, Fiona, but also what you've just shared, Chifalika, on approaches is not food aid and food support does not necessarily equal unhealthy, and maybe sharing the ways in which those have been done in healthier ways in different parts of the world might be something that could be helpful. Okay, how are we doing? Oh, we're doing great for time. Let's talk about, we've talked a little bit about children, and you've all mentioned a bit about schools. Somebody mentioned about, somebody asked whether, we know that we know about the risk of obesity and COVID mortality. Is there any evidence about COVID mortality or COVID severity and obesity in children or young people, or children, I think specifically, was asked. Would anyone like to answer that?
Yeah, I think that there has been very recent research, and I can't put my finger on it, but they are saying that obesity in children is a risk factor for worse outcomes. So previously they said, you know, children don't have bad outcomes with COVID, but now they're reflecting on what's been happening, and for sure, obese children are more likely to have poor outcomes, and also children with diabetes.
Okay, there's been a new question that makes me want to go back to the point you just made, Shifalika, around people sitting at home and watching more TV. Somebody has asked, talked about the app-based delivery of food, even in poor countries, and the explosion of that. In Jamaica or elsewhere, has this occurred in context of COVID? And is this a way to redress some of those market imbalances, particularly around kind of more domestic and healthier products versus the unhealthy?
Maybe I can answer that, Tolu. So yes, there's been a huge increase, we know, in home deliveries of food. But not all of that food is unhealthy. If you look at the data, there's also higher home delivery of fresh foods from supermarkets. And certainly in this region, there's been a massive increase of restaurants and street vendors, even little street vendors, now selling their food online and having it delivered, which is great because it's keeping people in work. It means that these street vendors have got some money. And not all that food is unhealthy. It's very mixed. I mentioned that UNICEF we're developing a relationship with Grab. So Grab are a delivery company. They deliver all sorts of goods, but a lot of that is food. To work with them to try to include messaging in their app. So when you flick on, there will be some messaging about what is healthy food and what isn't. This is our hope, because evidence seems to suggest that this is not going to go back to the way it was. People are not necessarily going to go back to shopping in markets and supermarkets, that home delivery of food is going to carry on at a much higher level than it has done.
Shifalika? You're muted.
It's a mixed bag. We still don't have India data, but from whatever anecdotal reports which have come in, see, ordering food in India is much more expensive than cooking at home. So a lot of places, of course, we've seen incomes dipping. So in those cases, you're seeing more cooking at home. Most food which is ordered here, the cooked food which is ordered, is unhealthy food. Because there are a lot of other constraints in cooking because of the high temperatures. The shelf life of healthy foods is much lower, and healthy foods is much more expensive. Fresh fruits and vegetables become very expensive in summer here. So most of the cooked food which is ordered at home is not healthy here. And so it's a mixed bag, but so we're seeing these different trends happening.
So this sounds to me a little bit like another thing that would be good to get a sense of what's happening in different parts of the world. I know, for example, in Lagos, in Nigeria, there have been innovations around the fresh wet markets, or the fresh fruit and vegetable markets that, you know, when the lockdown happened, you know, it went into WhatsApp, you know, and got decentralized into neighborhood level. And that was actually organized by the market women's association themselves. How that has played out, I'm not sure, but it would be interesting to some of these kind of community driven. So there are the apps and there's a top down, but they also seem to be decentralized approaches to get these fresh fruits and vegetables actually closer to people, because these are big markets that are often far away. So we've talked quite a bit about obesity in the context of COVID in general. Can we hone in a little bit on the inequities related to severity of COVID? So holding constant a COVID infection. I know here in the UK, we see huge disparities in Black minority and by minority ethnic groups, in terms of the severity of COVID disease and mortality. We also see, and that also speaks to the structural inequities that you mentioned, Shifalika, in terms of the gig economy and the continued exposure and vulnerability, even during the peak. So it'd be great to get your perspectives from those different regions. In Lafia.
Yes, so I think that you're asking about people's economic welfare, right, under COVID?
Well, in the context of, so speaking in the context of severity of COVID, because there is the prevalence of an incidence of COVID in general, and then there is another tier of inequity when it comes to the severity of disease, where you have obesity interacting with other structural inequities.
Well, we are very fortunate in that we don't have enough cases to really make that kind of analysis. In Jamaica, we have 3 million population. We have had about 600 cases and 10 deaths.
Okay.
When you go across the region, the numbers are not large enough to make that kind of analysis. So I don't know if there is equity in terms of the COVID outcomes.
Okay.
Good problem to have, right?
Yeah, right. To let us know when the tourism industry opens again.
Yeah, well, actually in Antigua, they actually had no COVID in Antigua, and they opened back to tourism because 90% of their income is from tourism. When you're a small island state, you often have like one big industry, and it's Caribbean, it's tourism. They open back and the tourists are bringing in the COVID. Yeah.
Right. Sorry, Shifalika?
Yeah, so there are major structural inequities where the COVID outcomes are concerned. First of all, the poor living in very highly dense environments. So you may have 5 people living in a room which may be 20 feet by 20 feet. So in such situations, the transmission becomes very high, as well as shared toilets and other things. So number of houses may be sharing one toilet. So there is a major structural inequity in the transmission. And obviously, if your basic immunity is lower, then you catch it faster. And then also at the stage of the healthcare system, because right now we are bursting. We are going through what Italy went through and what US went through. So our health systems in the main cities, where the travel cities, the Delhi, Bombay are the main Mumbai, where that foreign travel was there. So as I said, it's only coming from the foreign travelers and then seeped into the poor. So there is no bed available in the government hospitals. And the private hospitals are also up, full, and you can't afford their treatment. In the government hospital, you're not going to be giving them plasma therapy. They won't have so many oxygen things. They won't be having those remdesivir, those expensive antiviral drugs. And anyway, remdesivir only is supposed to decrease the hospitalization days. It's not supposed to change any mortality. So the are poor, of course, as you know, that we suffer from non-communicable diseases much more. They get it at a younger age. They're getting diabetes at lower BMIs, and despite obesity being a very, very strong, it's a much higher risk factor than all other countries in India. But despite that, the cutoff rates are much lower here. That means at lower obesity, you get higher much more chronic diseases. So we are getting the poor who are vulnerable to start with, basically from where they are, from the context of their living environment, and also the basic existence of comorbidities, and then the healthcare system. So the healthcare system is completely bursting. We don't have beds, and there's a shortage of doctors. Relative shortage means they're there, but the relative shortage of doctors and other things. So I think there are basic structural inequities which the poor face, whether it be the suffering, the transmission, the susceptibility to infection. Once they get the infection, the severity of infection, and then the quality of treatment. So there are no two ways about it. Over.
Okay. Fiona, did you want to add something to this?
I mean, I agree totally with what Shalif is saying. That's the same in this region as well, where you've got huge areas where people don't have safe water supplies. So asking people to wash their hands all the time when you don't have water is quite difficult, or you can't afford soap. And then the other thing, just to add, besides just the transmission, because people are living so close together, is that for many of the poorer people, they don't have a choice about not to go out to work or not to go out to, you know, try to obtain some basic things for subsisting. So the privilege that we've got, which is to stay at home in lockdown, a lot of people don't have. So they put themselves at, you know, they're at much higher risk of getting the disease. Just one figure which comes to mind, I think WHO it was, or maybe it was UNICEF, published recently. This is just talking about immunity and nutritional status the other way around, that wasted children are much more vulnerable to death because of COVID. And the modeling studies have shown that globally there will be a 14% increase in deaths because of wasting among children in the world. Quite frightening figures.
So it's interesting you mentioned around the luxury of staying at home. There's also beyond that, again speaking to the severity and the inequities of seeking when to access care, because there is that tension with working, also even to self-isolate or to quarantine if you've been exposed. So if you don't have the support, if you need the support to, if you've been a contact of somebody who's been infected, sitting at home for 2 weeks is challenging, could be challenging without extra support, and that's another avenue for inequities. We've got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of you, just to end on a what now. What can we do, especially if we take the perspective of the broader, how this is an amplification of ongoing and existing structural inequities that has just been highlighted and amplified, from a regulatory, from a fiscal, from an upstream. How do we take a systems approach to addressing this? What's the one thing that you would say we should start with? And I say start obviously because it's a complex multitude of approaches. We'll go in the order you appeared. So Olafia.
So I think one of the challenges that we have is change in food culture that has happened globally over the past few decades, where French fries are now the staple food in almost any country you can go to, and everybody wants French fries. I think COVID really has exacerbated that and perhaps made it worse. So I think we have to just redouble the efforts we were making pre-COVID in terms of addressing unhealthy diets, and we can't match them with marketing. Can KFC spend billions of dollars every year on marketing? What we can do is taxation, regulation, and legislation. So we have to go back to that. Taxing unhealthy foods, regulating how much salt and fat and so on can be in foods, and passing legislation. For example, in Jamaica, the Minister of Health and the Minister of Education have determined that in schools, the foods sold in schools need to meet certain guidelines in terms of sugar, salt, and fat. I think that's the only thing we have and that we can do.
Thank you. Thanks, Olafia. Fiona?
Totally agree with Olafia. We do need to have control of the food and beverage industry and much stronger regulation. At the same time, looking more positively, we need to increase the demand for a healthy food system as a whole. And I have great belief in youth. And one of the good things that's come out of COVID is the use of technology and the realization that it is such a powerful thing, and it can be used for bad, for evil, but it can also be used for good. And I think that we'll see an explosion in the use of technology to help get children who demand a much better society for themselves than they're getting now, a much better deal. Thank you.
Thanks, that's great, Fiona. And lastly, Shifalika.
Multi-sectoral policies need to be health and environment friendly at the larger global and the country level. A strong public health care system and strong investment in social determinants of health. So that's what.
Thank you. Oh, that's great. So a strong regulatory framework, harnessing technology and youth to increase demand for better society, and multi-sectoral action. Our work is cut out, and it's great. I should mention, we're all World Obesity Policy and Prevention Committee members. So I look forward to working with the panelists, World Obesity, and all of the participants to effect this change. So thank you all. Thanks to the panelists, and thanks to the participants for your questions and for tuning in. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.